Let's talk about digital portraits. Rather than sketching out the face with a pencil, I'm using a thick brush so that I can sculpt the face rather than draw it. When I started creating digitally, I was constantly chasing my traditional methods. And usually I would sketch out my portraits with a pencil. I would tediously go through using the sight size method to try to get the proportions right. When I stopped thinking about painting as an extension of drawing and more like sculpting, I completely busted through my plateau. That's why, as you can see here with this drawing method, I'm not even using a pencil. I'm using brushes that are way too thick, and I'm using a technique called cutting to reveal the image. And the idea behind cutting is switching back and forth between two different colors, or in this case values, to get the boundaries of your shapes right. You can see the entire time I'm trying to use brushes that are way too big. And that forces me to create big shapes, and again, pushes me further away from the idea of drawing. Not that I'm bad at drawing by any means, but drawing has a time and a place. And when it comes to painting portraits, I like to try to reveal the face rather than capture it, if that makes any sense. I try to tell myself that the face is already there, I'm just trying to bring it out of the shades. So right around this point, you can see I've used about 3 shades. I want to show you something up here. So check that out. The way that I blend everything together is by using a very small brush. So I paint with a big brush and I blend with a small brush. And what the small brush does when I'm painting is it allows me to reinforce the form. This is what I mean when I say use a smudge tool that is far too small for the job. As you can see, crazy to use such a small brush, but actually it gives you such a nice result if you follow the shape of the form. So what I'm doing is I'm just using small back and forth strokes like this, and I am just constantly following the shape of the ball. You really get a sense that this is a 3-dimensional object when you use a smudge tool like this. Now, if you want it to be a cleaner gradient, what you can do is follow the contours in a different direction. So check this out. I'm still gonna curve along the ball, but I'm just starting at a different point. So the smudges are still following the form, but in a different direction. And we can go again from a different direction completely. And what this technique is going to do is allow you to define really complex 3D forms. Now, it doesn't really make sense when you're rendering a sphere because you could literally just use a soft round brush to define the shape. But check out how easy it is with this technique to take a chunk out of this sphere. So I'm just gonna take a little bit of that darker black and then that pure white. I'll do the white on this side, okay. And now with our smudge tool that is far too small, the key is to only make your strokes as long as you want the gradient to be. So the width of the gradient will always be the length of the stroke. Rather than having to worry about getting the size of your brush right, the actual transition between the values is only as far as you drag your pencil. So to me, this is a very intuitive way of rendering. Now we do the same thing but perpendicular to smooth out that transition. But again, every one of my brush strokes is following the curve of this form. Now we very quickly created a convincing crater on this sphere. When you start smudging your colors together or your values, what happens is everything starts to look really smooth and nice, but you lose your contrast because your lights and darks are starting to bleed into each other. So what I like to do is do passes of blending. So you can see after the first pass of smudging, I start to add in more highlights again, and I'm trying to only blend the edges of the highlights that I add so that I can keep their luminance. Here I added a paper texture right on top and I changed the transfer mode to overlay. Now I've created a new layer, I've changed the transfer mode to color, and I've started adding the colors of the skin. I like to do this with a very hard brush so that I can separate the different parts of the face. By using a hard brush, I can really isolate the red tones around the nose, the cheeks, and the ears. I'm adding a lot of texture to the sweater for some reason that no one's going to notice or care about. And the final part of this process, other than cleaning up the silhouette, is adding in very thin, true black lines to reinforce the structure of the ear, for example. You see there, just like that. And you can see that I added it to the eyes here as well and accentuated the pupils and the nostrils. So the hair starts off as a very simple blob. I add tiny highlights and then I use, again, a small brush to smudge everything out. It's very simple. You just have to follow the contours and the motion of the hair. And then to really push the realism of the hair, you pick whip the color of your highlights and just start going over it with really, really fine lines that have lowered opacity. And then I'm gonna do that same thing, but pick whip a dark color. You can see it populating there. And then you do that all over the hair. And eventually you'll get something really nice. One thing I want to emphasize is something called subsurface scattering. You can see it here in the forehead really well. Where the light turns to dark, the color of the core shadow becomes more saturated. The reason it becomes saturated is because there's no light on the skin, but light is still bouncing through the skin, and it manifests as a more saturated red or orange color. So you can see here in the forehead, it's got that general skin tone color, and then where it transitions into shadow, it becomes a little bit more red. And the same thing happens here around the eyes. You can see it's more red where the shadow is transitioning. And probably the most clear example of this is right under the nose. We tend to get a lot of red and orange tones. So there you go, some tips to approach a digital portrait. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments if there's anything you're struggling with, and I'll try to make a tutorial for you. Now get out of here and go do some art.